The Middle Ages were not only a dark age of wars and plague, but also an era of love, desire, and a surprisingly rich intimate life. Even though the church watched over everything with strict rules, in reality people always found their way to closeness. In this video, you will learn how peasants, townsmen behind the city walls, noble aristocracy, and even those bound to celibacy loved and lived their sexuality. For example, we will reveal that according to church regulations, the average married couple was legally allowed to make love less than once a week. Yet medieval Europe certainly did not die out, and the population grew. We will uncover how it was possible that up to a third of brides in the 14th century walked to the altar already pregnant. And also why public bathhouses were the center of everything, a bit like today's nightclubs. Prepare yourself for a journey across centuries and various corners of Europe. In a moment, we will uncover how intimacy was experienced differently by peasants in the countryside, townspeople in busy streets, knights in castles, and monks in monasteries. The medieval bedroom will reveal its secrets. Let us begin in the countryside in the cottage of a typical peasant family. Imagine a simple wooden room where the whole family lived together, parents, children, and grandparents. Privacy almost did not exist. When darkness fell and the work in the fields ended, sex belonged among the most common amusements of ordinary people. After all, what else could one indulge in under a thatched roof? Peasants also took it practically. Children were a welcome reinforcement of the workforce on the farm and a security for the future, so having many of them meant a greater chance that at least a few offspring would survive into adulthood. In this video you will learn why even the presence of children in the same room did not prevent parents from intimate moments. Medieval people did not perceive sexuality as prudishly as we do. They often simply waited until the children fell asleep or sent them to collect firewood, and in the meantime they indulged in marital pleasure behind closed doors. It was common that children from a very early age knew what their parents did at night. Intimacy was not a taboo surrounded by embarrassment but rather a natural part of life. The church did preach that sexual intercourse belonged only to marriage and preferably only for the purpose of procreation, but the reality of the countryside was different. Young people often did not wait with sexuality until the wedding. According to records of chroniclers and ecclesiastical courts, a considerable portion of brides were pregnant already on the day of the wedding. It is estimated that as many as 1 in 3. This means that premarital sex was secretly quite common in the countryside, whether in the form of betrothal taken as a trial or simply as a result of the fact that nature would not wait. Church preachers thundered against fornication and threatened sinners with hell, but the village community mostly dealt with more practical matters. If a girl became pregnant, the family tried to arrange a marriage so that everything would be settled. Such a wedding out of necessity, with a belly under the dress, was nothing unusual. The marriages of peasants usually did not arise from romantic love but from neighborhood ties and family agreements. In small communities, partners were often close since childhood, sometimes too close according to the church. The church forbade marriages between relatives up to the 7th degree, which was quite a problem in isolated villages, because almost everyone had some distant kinship. But even that was bypassed with a dispensation, a permit from the bishop, or simple ignoring until no one asked. For serfs bound to the soil of their lord it also applied that they needed the consent of the overlord for marriage. The lord sometimes collected a fee called the wedding due, and at other times they could forbid the marriage if it meant losing labor force. In this video you will soon learn about the terrifying rumor that the medieval lord had the right of the first night with the bride of his serf. Was it truth or myth? The so-called ius primi noctis, the right of the first night, is today considered more of a legend. There is no evidence that in the Middle Ages it was legally valid anywhere that a nobleman might enjoy the bride of his serf during the wedding night. However, powerful magnates often took what they wanted, and rural women were no exception. From preserved complaints we know that some lords or officials enforced a kind of self-proclaimed right to deflower the girl before handing her over to her husband. Sometimes it was abuse of power by force, other times a love affair under the guise of protection, and the ashamed family preferred silence. Some girls even boasted that the lord desired them, perversely considering it a certain honor. The consequence, however, was numerous illegitimate children of nobles with common women. About simple village youths it was bitterly joked that they had to wait until the Lord was satisfied, or that all that remained for them was patience and prayer, because they had no money for prostitutes anyway. Indeed, rural men could not afford paid pleasure, unlike wealthier classes. Prostitution was almost non-existent in the countryside. The closed village society did not tolerate it. If a woman offered her body, she did so secretly in an inn by the road or under the protection of roaming soldiers when they passed through. Nevertheless, we cannot say that villagers were promiscuous or lived in some kind of sexual anarchy. On the contrary, the community closely watched the morals of its members. Whoever committed adultery, was unfaithful to a spouse, risked harsh condemnation. He could be shamed in public, sometimes punished by the feudal lord or the ecclesiastical court. In some regions a custom of punishing adulterers was preserved. Neighbors put donkey ears on the court couple or seated them backwards on a donkey and paraded them through the village amidst mockery. This resembled the so-called charivari. Such public disgrace hurt more than physical punishment. Generally, however, peasants were practical and indulgent. As long as no one broke up a family and no scandal arose, eyes were closed. Sexuality was simply part of life, as natural as work or food. And as we shall see, simple peasants sometimes had looser customs than the higher classes, especially when it came to choosing a partner for love. Soon we will reveal what happened when the son of a peasant and the daughter of a smallholder truly loved each other and how young people courted in the village. And then we will move into the towns, where a completely different world awaits us, full of bathhouses, prostitutes, and nightlife. Medieval towns were a world of bustling markets, artisan workshops, university schools, and night establishments. While in the countryside a relatively clear morality of a small community ruled, in towns anonymity and the concentration of people created an explosion of various expressions of intimate life. From respectable marital bedrooms of townsmen through love affairs of neighbors to open prostitution. In the High Middle Ages, approximately the 12th to 14th centuries, when towns grew and prospered, love and sex between stone walls flourished. And surprisingly, neither the church nor secular authorities maintained such strict order as we might expect. Urban marriage differed from rural marriage. For townsmen, merchants, and craftsmen, the wedding was often a matter of business. Families arranged unions so that they would connect property or crafts, sometimes gaining city rights. Young fiancés often hardly knew each other before the wedding, and romantic love played little role. Nevertheless, even among townspeople there were couples who married for love. This was especially true for the poor, where there was nothing to calculate, or for widowers and widows choosing a second partner according to sympathy. Courtship in towns took place under the supervision of families. Manuals for burgher girls have been preserved on how to behave modestly, or reports about how young men stood under the windows of girls and sang them songs. In the 14th century, for example, in Italian cities the custom of serenades and night visits spread. Something that drove burgher fathers mad because it smelled of scandal. But if everything was observed, the wedding was lavish, and marriage then relatively free. Burgher women had quite a strong word in the household, especially when the husband traveled for trade. Medieval sources show that a woman could run a workshop or shop in the absence of her husband and take care of finances, which proves a certain respect in the family. But that applied mainly to respectable couples. What happened behind closed doors of taverns, bathhouses, and brothels in the city was a different chapter. In fact, in the Middle Ages, public houses appeared for the first time. Prostitution as the oldest profession had existed earlier, but in the Middle Ages it took on new forms. As towns grew, councillors realized they could not completely eliminate prostitutes and so tried to at least tame and tax them. Already in the 13th century it was common for the town itself to operate an official brothel somewhere outside the centre. In Paris, London, Prague, or Rome, there were designated streets of love. For example, in France almost every larger town had a municipal brothel, some as grand as a palace. Behind the walls or in the suburbs there were also unofficial taverns where a few girls offered their services. There was no shortage of customers. Testimonies suggest that practically every man in the High Middle Ages came into contact with a prostitute at some point. Before official brothels existed, prostitutes wandered through pubs, stood at city gates, in parks, or at the market at dusk. Authorities chased them from one place to another, repeatedly expelling them from public bathhouses because they corrupted morals. Bathhouses themselves became famous places of unrestrained fun. Originally they served for cleansing the body. Men, women, and children bathed naked, often separately, but gradually the boundaries blurred. In the High Middle Ages, bathhouses functioned more like today's wellness clubs combined with a bar and bedroom. People came to bathe, talk, play cards, feast, drink wine, and, as you might guess, the ever-present nudity and merriment led also to love games. Bathhouses became the center of sexual life in the city. Not only prostitutes offered massages there, but even respectable burgher women sometimes came with the intent of innocent flirtation, which could easily slip into sin. Chronicles shockingly describe that in bathhouses young and old, married and single, copulated together, even in the tubs during feasts with a cup in hand. Woodcuts from the 15th century depict naked couples in vats with food and drink, scenes like from a wild bachelor party. Authorities long closed their eyes to it and church sermons achieved little. After all, bathhouses were officially places of hygiene, and what happened behind screens was hard to control. Some houses, however, turned into outright brothels. Cries and laughter could be heard so loudly that it was impossible to ignore. Such freedom, however, did not last forever. Times changed, and in the 15th century not only new diseases penetrated Europe. Syphilis at the end of the 15th century hit the promiscuous community hard. But above all, new religious movements called for the cleansing of morals. In the Czech lands came the Hussites at the beginning of the 15th century, and with them a drastic end to the tolerance of prostitution. One of the 4 famous Prague articles from 1420 ordered strict punishment of all deadly sins, especially those public and striking. Among the mortal sins fornication and especially prostitution were named. The Hussites drove prostitutes from towns, banned dances, smashed tubs in bathhouses. Captain Jan Eicher in his military code explicitly stated that in the army he did not want to tolerate adulterers, fornicators, whores, and that they would be mercilessly punished. In Prague the Hussite faction closed all brothels, and chroniclers mention that the prostitutes of the time had to either marry or disappear, otherwise they risked their lives. This strict moral revolution was rather an exception of region and time. After the end of the Hussite wars and gradual calming, many bathhouses and brothels in Prague and elsewhere were restored, although in much more modest form. The general trend of the late Middle Ages of the 15th century was toward stricter public morals. The end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Reformation were approaching, which would bring further changes. Soon we will move from the boisterous city to the world of castles and palaces. What did the intimate life of the nobility look like? We will see that while townsmen and peasants dealt with love and sin secretly or within the community, noble lords and ladies had their own rules of the game. Grand courtly romance on the one hand and spicy scandals on the other. Let us now enter the splendid chambers of castles and palaces where medieval nobility resided. At first glance it would seem that the life of noble ladies and lords was full of formality and virtue. After all, knights took vows of purity to their chosen lady, and courtly ethics commanded the protection of women's honor. But reality was twofold. In public, dignity and idealized love. In private, often lovers, mistresses, and stormy affairs. The intimate life of the nobility had its own rules, which changed over the centuries. Noble marriages were almost always a matter of state or family politics. From the early Middle Ages it was common that noble children, especially daughters, were betrothed at a very young age so that families could secure alliances. Love played no role. Marriage was about reason, or rather calculation. For example, queens often married at 14 or 15 to significantly older kings, because it suited dynastic plans. In Northern Europe, Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages perhaps preserved looser customs. We know from Viking sagas that their marriage sometimes involved love and women had the right to demand divorce, such as when a husband was unable to fulfill marriage in the male sense. But as Christianity penetrated there, conditions aligned with the continent. Marriage became indissoluble. Divorce did not exist, only annulment for serious reasons, and the goal was the begetting of heirs. Noble women often bore children in short intervals because dynasties needed more offspring, and also because child mortality was high. When a lady bore a son as heir, her prestige rose. On the other hand, infertility or only daughters brought misfortune, even replacement of the wife. Formally marriage could not be dissolved, so loopholes were sought, most often declaring a marriage invalid due to alleged kinship or other formality. In the High and Late Middle Ages, adultery among the nobility was an open secret. Men, especially rulers, had mistresses among court ladies or even foreigners. King Charles IV of the 14th century, one of the most important Czech kings and Holy Roman Emperor, had officially 4 wives, one after another, and with them 11 legitimate children. But he also admitted to several illegitimate children and mistresses. He himself wrote in his autobiography about a wild youth and openly acknowledged one illegitimate son in France. For kings and magnates it was common to have mistresses. Society considered it obvious. There was even a saying that a king without a mistress was not a real king. When the queen was pregnant and could not share the bed, the ruler simply spent nights elsewhere. Naturally, noble women also had lovers, but they had to be much more cautious. Female infidelity was punished harshly, at least with lifelong confinement in a convent, at worst even worse. Yet sources suggest that many noble ladies found love affairs, often with a knight or court poet, and sometimes even tolerated by the husband if it was discreet. Just to keep peace at home. Courtiers lived in a strange symbiosis. Marriage ensured offspring and alliances, while feelings and passion were realized outside the official framework. Even within the nobility, changes occurred across centuries. The early Middle Ages, the 6th to 10th centuries, was still marked by remnants of pagan customs. Some rulers had multiple wives or concubines. For example, Frankish Merovingians or even Charlemagne had several wives and concubines at once. The Church criticized this but did not always have the power to enforce change. Gradually, however, Christian monogamy prevailed, and from the 12th century polygamy was unthinkable. A ruler could have only one queen. But the fashion of official mistresses at court spread. French kings in the 14th and 15th centuries commonly granted the title of maîtresse en titre to their main mistress, and she had significant influence. In Italy, late 15th century Renaissance rulers were notorious for leading rather debauched courts. For example, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan, organized banquets with naked courtesans as actors. Cultural differences existed. Southern Europe, Italy, France, Spain, had more ostentatious and often morally looser courts, while Northern Europe, England, Scandinavia, was somewhat more sober outwardly, though in private it also thrived. The English King Edward IV in the 15th century was known as a womanizer, but English court etiquette concealed it in public better than the French. In the Czech lands it depended on the ruler. Under Charles IV the court strove to appear pious, whereas under Wenceslas IV, Charles's son, debauched feasts with women of easy virtue were held at Prague Castle, as chroniclers vividly describe. Finally, it should be mentioned that love and affection as such were not unknown to the nobility. It was just considered weakness to show them too openly. Yet there are preserved beautiful letters of medieval couples from higher classes filled with genuine affection and tenderness. For example, the English knight and Lady Parton in the 15th century exchanged letters full of loving expressions and concern for one another, even though they had already been married for many years and had several children. Such examples remind us that even in the world of dynastic marriages, love could sometimes blossom between spouses. Sometimes fortune favored them and families arranged a couple who suited each other and fell in love. In other cases, love remained outside marriage in secrecy. In any case, the intimate life of the nobility was a complicated game of duty and desire, where official morality often differed from the hidden reality of bedrooms. And what about those who publicly vowed to live in celibacy and chastity? In the next chapter we will look behind the monastery walls and into the parish house of a village church to see how clergy struggled with love and sexuality. Medieval Europe was permeated with Christian faith and moral authority. Those who preached and guarded this morality, priests, monks, nuns, were supposed to set an example. Church teaching was clear. Sex belonged only within marriage and only for procreation. Whoever served God as a cleric had to observe celibacy, complete abstinence. The ideal was lofty. A priest or monk was to devote himself to pure service, not bodily pleasures. Marriage was to be honored as a sacred union. But as often happens, human nature found its ways, and reality was far from the ideal. In the early Middle Ages, priestly celibacy was not yet strictly required. Many priests, especially in the countryside, were married or lived with so-called concubines and effectively unofficial wives. Even some bishops had children, and popes were not much better. The famous case of Pope John X in the 10th century, who allegedly turned the Lateran Palace into a brothel. The turning point came in the 11th century with the so-called Gregorian reform. Church councils forbade priests to marry and ordered them to dismiss concubines. From then celibacy was binding, at least in Western Europe. In the Orthodox East, parish priests could remain married. But decrees on paper were one thing, life another. Especially in remote areas, priests continued to take wives, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly with the blessing of the community. They simply did not call it marriage. In the 14th century, the English reformer John Wycliffe complained that almost every priest had his concubine and no one found it strange. Similarly, in Bohemia, Jan Hus sharply criticized priests for preaching water and drinking wine. Specifically, that they preached against fornication but themselves kept women. Hus and his followers even demanded that priests should rather have lawful wives than secret concubines, because they considered the first a lesser evil. This, however, collided with the Catholic Church, which defended celibacy as sacred. After the Hussite Wars in the 15th century, in the Utraquist Church some priests indeed married, but in the official Catholic Church this would not happen until much later, essentially in the 16th century among Protestants. So what did the intimate life of those who were not supposed to have any look like? Torn between sanctity and temptation. Many clerics kept their vow and lived chastely despite difficulties. Monks in monasteries watched each other, prayed, fasted, and tried in all ways to suppress bodily desires. Some through self-flagellation, others through intense work. Legends tell of saints tormented by erotic dreams who in desperation jumped into thorn bushes or icy water just to cool their lust. Those are the heroic stories of chastity. But there was also another group of clergy who succumbed to temptation. In large monasteries there were sometimes breaches of vows. Loving pairs of monks and nuns sent notes over monastery walls. They met at charitable events or secretly slipped into each other's cells at night. There are recorded cases of nuns giving birth to children. Such scandals were usually hushed up by sending the guilty away far and leaving the child in a convent orphanage. Sometimes, however, revealed sins led to the dissolution of the entire monastery for moral corruption. On parish houses it was similar. A village priest often lived with one woman openly as with a housekeeper. Everyone knew she was in fact his wife, just she could not be called that. Villagers mostly tolerated it. They said it was better for the priest to have his own woman than to do indecencies with married women around. There was even a proverb, where the priest's cook is, 7 sins run away. It meant that if a priest had a steady woman, he would supposedly not bother others. The church officially forbade such cohabitation and punished it, requiring payment of a fine called culegium, a tax for a concubine. In practice many bishops closed their eyes and were satisfied that a priest lived orderly with one woman, cared for her and for the children he had with her, and no scandal arose. Urban priests, however, had a worse reputation. They were not under such close watch of neighbors. Many of them frequented brothels, even though it was forbidden. In fact, entry to a brothel was formally banned to married men and clergy, but for the latter it was often tolerated if they were not caught. In some towns it was said that brothels were full of tonsured heads, a reference to monks and priests as frequent clients. This provoked enormous outrage among reformers such as Jan Hus. The church, however, was strict not only about the behavior of its clergy but about sexuality in general. There were numerous prohibitions and regulations about when and how intimacy was allowed, applying to all believers. Let us recall that one could not have intercourse on Sundays, on Thursdays and Fridays, on church feast days, during Lent and Advent, during a woman's menstruation, 6 weeks after birth, and during breastfeeding. Summed up, the average couple was allowed marital relations only once or twice a week according to these rules. And even then the church prescribed how, only face to face, man on top. Anything else, from behind, standing up, or even woman on top, was considered unnatural and sinful because it was said to hinder conception. Oral sex or anal practices were a mortal sin, sodomy, and punished very harshly. Homosexual acts were likewise labeled sodomy, and especially from the High Middle Ages, severe penalties threatened. In some Italian or French towns cases of burning men convicted of the fire sin were recorded. For completeness, let us add that the Middle Ages did not know the concept of gay identity as today. It was taken purely as an act, and a forbidden one. As for contraception and abortion, the Church fundamentally condemned them. Yet people tried various means, herbs such as rue, hyssop, wormwood, supposedly to prevent conception or induce miscarriage. Mechanical barriers were also used, like spongy tampons soaked in vinegar by women. All this secretly, for if discovered, there was a threat of punishment for murder of the unborn. Interestingly, medieval medical writings authored by monks paradoxically contained such recipes, supposedly for treatment in extreme need. On the other hand, the legendary chastity belts are more of a myth. The often mentioned iron panties with which knights supposedly locked their wives are a later invention, and the preserved pieces are later fakes or torture devices, not real tools used in the Middle Ages. From clerics who struggled with human nature came another curious phenomenon, the erotic undertone of religious mysticism. Some medieval saints, nuns, and monks wrote in their visions of union with Christ or the Virgin Mary so ardently that today's reader feels a sexual charge. For example, Saint Teresa, in true 16th century, described the ecstasy from the touch of an angel's spear so vividly that Bernini created his famous sculpture of the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, which looks highly sensual. Similar expressions had already appeared in the 13th century with Mechthild of Magdeburg or in the 14th century with St. Catherine of Siena when describing their mystical marriage with Christ. It was probably a way of channeling suppressed erotic energy into spiritual experience. On the other hand, the church world also knew the cruel effects of suppressed sexuality. Sometimes scandals surfaced about abuse, for example reports of corrupt abbeys where monks abused novices. Yes, homosexuality also appeared behind monastery walls, and not only there. In the 14th century the Pope dealt with a case where a parish priest seduced local boys into sin, described in Latin as corrupter puerorum, corrupter of boys. The Church tried to hush up such cases, but we know they existed. The reaction to such phenomena was constant tightening of moral rules in the late Middle Ages. In short, clerics officially preached strict sexual morality, but they were only human. Many sincerely struggled with their desires, others secretly yielded to them. The public saw it and often criticized the Church for hypocrisy. This is probably one reason why the Middle Ages witnessed so many religious reform movements calling for purification and correction of the Church's sins, and sexuality played a large role in this. Whether it was monastic reformers like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century denouncing depraved abbeys, or the Hussites in the 15th century sounding the alarm against clerical fornication, all dealt with the same question, how to reconcile nature with the ideal. The journey through the intimate life of the Middle Ages has shown us a world full of paradoxes. On one hand, very strict rules and taboos. On the other hand, a creative spirit that always found ways to bypass them. A modern person would blush in the city bathhouses of the 14th century and shake their head at church bands dictating the schedule of marital intercourse. At the same time, he would be surprised by the openness and directness with which medieval people treated sexuality. No false prudishness, rather pragmatism. Through all the differences something remained common, the desire for love, union, and understanding. Whether peasant, townsman, knight, or nun, all were people of flesh and blood with hearts longing for closeness. Today we have the freedom to choose partners for love, to speak openly about sexuality, to plan parenthood, achievements medieval people could hardly imagine. On the other hand, some prejudices and stereotypes about the role of men and women, rooted for instance in the image of woman as Eve's daughter and temptress, persisted for centuries and influenced even modern times. It is fascinating to see where our norms come from, why we have weddings in church, why we speak of the sanctity of marriage. Many of these were born in the Middle Ages. At the end, a small challenge: if the stories of medieval love and spicy details surprised you, share this video with your friends. Let us show that history need not be dry and boring, but can still inspire and entertain us. After all, love in all its forms accompanies humanity through the ages.